All right. Let's go ahead and knock these couple lectures out. This will essentially be for week two, lecture number three of the summer. All right, this is week two, officially lecture number three. This is dealing with ethics, right? What makes someone, what makes a person morally good, okay? So, in your readings, you will have a short piece by Aristotle, the Nicomachean Ethics. You'll have Immanuel Kant, a piece in there, and then that should be enough for this short summer class. All right. I hope that the first week, the awareness of self and all that kind of thing was hopeful. All right. What you need to think about this lecture or terms like what is ethics, um, what is virtue, eudaimonia, habit, duty, categorical imperative, dignity, utilitarianism, and consequences. Right. One of the great moral dangers of our time is that we have learned how to look good without becoming good. Faking it till we make it. We know how to say the language of justice or say the language of care or inclusion or say the language of excellence or faith or even patriotism, being a good family member or service. We know how to post concern, perform outrage, and even present ourselves as decent people. But philosophy asks a more difficult question. What kind of person am I becoming when no one is applauding? Ethics is the branch of philosophy that asks how we should live. What is right? What is wrong? What is good? What is bad? What kind of person or person should we be and become? And what do we owe to others? Ethics is not just following rules, right? It's not even private opinion, right, about who people think you should be. It's not what feels right in the moment. Ethics asks us to examine our reasons, our habits, our duties, our consequences, right, and our character. That's what ethics does, right? So if we had to define ethics, we would say it's the philosophical study of good character, of right actions, moral responsibility, and the good life, right? So I want to kind of discuss three major approaches: Aristotle's ethics, Kant's ethics, and Mill's utilitarianism. Okay, Aristotle, Kant, and Mill. Right? They really didn't say the same thing, but all together they kind of give you a sort of a moral framework, if you will, right? So Aristotle is about character. It's about flourishing. He lived about 380 to about 322 BC. He was a Greek philosopher, a student of Plato, right? Who was a student of who? Socrates, right? And Aristotle was the teacher of Alexander the Great, right? He wrote on science and politics and rhetoric and poetry, and Aristotle wrote on psychology and obviously, like I said, all the sciences. If we remember Plato, and Plato looks toward like bigger forms, the bigger ideals, Aristotle kind of looks more on the ground, right? With classifications, with practice, with the purpose of things, right? Aristotle fits sort of within philosophy as a foundational figure for sure of ethics and logic, of metaphysics, and political philosophy as well, I think, right? In ethics, what we're doing now, he's especially important because he asks, sort of not merely what rules should I follow, right? But what kind of person should I become, right? Aristotle's major ethical work is the Nicomachean Ethics, right? That book, right? Which you'll have an excerpt for. His main point there: every action that we do aims toward a good, right? Medicine aims toward health, right? Strategy aims at what? Victory, right? Shipbuilding, right? Aims at what? War, right? So the highest good is what Aristotle calls eudaimonia, right? Eudaimonia, sort of human flourishing, living well, right? The sort of the good spirit, right? Or happiness, right? The state of happiness, not a moment of happiness, but a life that is going well, right? I'm living in eudaimonia, right? And it's important because Aristotle don't really care if you feel good today, right? He's asking whether or not your life is becoming excellent, is ordered, or fully human, right? For Aristotle, we flourish when we act according to reason and virtue, right? So, what do we mean by virtue? Virtue is like an excellence of character that allows a person to live or act well, right? Courage is a virtue, right? Honesty is a virtue. Generosity is a virtue. Justice is a virtue. Patience, right, is a virtue. You've heard that. Temperance, friendship. Aristotle says practical wisdom is a virtue, right? But virtues aren't just simply ideas that we admire, right? Aristotle says that we become virtuous through what? Through habit, right? By doing just and right and correct and good actions, right? We become courageous by what? Practicing courage. We become generous by doing good things, right? It isn't by accident. We train ourselves. We become what we repeatedly practice, right? I am what I keep on doing, right? I don't do it, I'm not good by accident. I sort of do consistently good things. If I repeatedly practice dishonesty, right, I become what? Deceptive, right? If I repeatedly practice cruelty, right, I become evil, right? If I repeatedly practice courage, though, courage becomes more available and part of my what? Disposition. If I repeatedly practice gratitude, I see the world differently. I see people differently, right? So Aristotle teaches this doctrine called the mean, right? MEAN, right? The mean between two extremes, right? And virtue is between these things, right? Virtue is between cowardice and recklessness, right? Generosity is generosity lies between wastefulness and stinginess, for instance, right? Um, kindness is not cruelty, right? Right, and kindness is not, sort of, being stupid either, right? But you must, Aristotle says, we must do the right thing toward the right action in the right way for the right reason, right? You should write that down, right? The right thing in the right way toward the right goal for the right reason, right? Um, Aristotle's concerned about how we act in particular situations. Ethics isn't like math, right? So this is one of the hardest things in class to do, this idea of the mean, right? It's not a quantitative mean, right? It's not, the mean between, 2 and 6 is 4 kind of thing, right? But it's about the balance, right, of two extremes, right? Does that make sense to you? Ethics requires sort of a trained perspective, right? That's Aristotle, right? So we turn to Immanuel Kant, right? Kant. Kant is a little bit later, right? From 18th century, like 1720 something to about 1804, 05, something like that. He lived in Russia, even though he's a German philosophy, right? He is one of the most important philosophers in the modern period. He wrote major work in epistemology, right? Metaphysics, ethics, aesthetics, even religion, right? And obviously political philosophy, right? Um, His Critique of Pure Reason, one of the hardest books I've ever read, I still don't understand. And it's fun teaching it in upper level philosophy classes because we all just struggling through it, right? But for this conversation, the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals, and I think it's one of the most influential accounts of moral duty, right? Which is what we're going to talk about here. Kant fits within philosophy as a central figure in philosophy dealing with deontological ethics, right? Dion, which is my middle name, come from the root word duty, right? Deontology, duty, the duty-based ethics, right? So Kant's concerned with whether or not ethics, your action accords to the moral law, right? So deontology then is an ethical theory that's concerned with duty, the moral law, and what is good for itself, right? Kant believes that you can't do the good things on feelings, right? Because feelings change, right? Feelings are selective, right? We may be compassionate toward people who look like us, but then indifferent toward folk who ain't, right? We're compassionate. If I'm a Republican, I'm compassionate about MAGA, but I don't give a damn about them Democrats. You know what I'm saying? So the categorical imperative is Kant's main sort of contribution to philosophy. He calls the categorical imperative a sort of if you want to act, right? If you want to do something, you need to do something, right? If you want X, do Y. If you want money, do work, right? That's how most people do. But then the categorical imperative to Kant says you must do this because morality or goodness requires you to do it, right? So the difference between doing it for a reason, right? I want wealth, I gotta go work. It's a question of doing it for the right reason, right? If everyone cheated whenever they can get away with it, for instance, right? The very practice of grading, for instance, or making a promise or competition would be sort of undermined, right? Uh, but for this sort of short lecture, the most important formulation for Kant is what he calls the humanity formulation, or more like the golden rule, right? Treat people as an end and not as a means to an end, right? Right? People must be used to be treated with dignity, a worth, not usefulness, not status, not convenience, but moral worth, right? Don't use nobody as means, right? And we do it a lot. Students use professors, right? I use mechanics to fix my car. I use a doctor for medical care, right? That's what we use them for, right? A cashier to buy some food at the store, right? But the moral problem that Kant wants, you don't treat people as merely means, as if their humanity doesn't matter, right? People are not tools, right? A society becomes dangerous when human beings become instruments, right? When workers become just units in labor, right? Students just become tuition dollars, right? Immigrants just become a political symbols, if you prisoners are just revenue for a society, right? Black bodies are just threats, right? Women are objects objectified. Children are just talking points, right? Older people or the elderly become burdens, right? We can't. These are just objectified or tools, people, right? The tool we treat people as tools, not with dignity, right? Kant says we need to make sure that we treat people as ends and not means to an end. On the flip side, you have somebody like John Stuart Mill, the third person we're going to talk about, the British philosopher John Stuart Mill. Um, and his point is moral utilitarianism. Mill was an advocate for political rights. Um, he was deeply shaped by Jeremy Bentham, who was the sort of the father of utilitarianism, right? But Mill's utilitarianism is like the opposite of Kant, right? Kant's deontology, Mill is moral consequentialism or moral utilitarianism, right? He has a famous book called Utilitarianism, right? And basically, he says that actions are right in as much as they promote happiness, right? And they're wrong in as much as they produce pain, right? So utilitarianism, by definition, then would be something like an ethical theory that evaluates actions by its consequences for overall happiness and world and well-being, right? And so he has this principle called the greatest happiness principle, and he says that actions are correct or right in proportion to its ability to promote happiness, and it's wrong if it produces the reverse of happiness, right? More pleasure, good. More pain, bad. But morality isn't like Kant about virtue, or like Aristotle like virtue, like Kant like duty. It's about what are you maximizing, right? Do my choices reduce or increase suffering? Does my policy promote well-being or misery? Right? Who's affected? How many people are affected? How deeply are people affected? This is important, right? Can we think about the stuff that I do, like public policy stuff, or university rule, or health policy, or criminal justice practice, right? A war, for instance, like we're under now, right? Taxes or things like that, environmental decision. It's hard to do that just by intentions, right? We have to pay attention to consequences. War matters. Suffering matters and benefit matter. So that's why utilitarianism is popular to people, right? But here's the problem. If we focus totally on happiness, don't we sacrifice folk? Don't we not have to justify inequality or who's able to sort of count the good and discount the bad, right? Consequentialism is that is a problem because consequences matter because people are more than just numbers, right? So, in summary, Aristotle says, what kind of person am I becoming? What is my character? Kant asks, am I respecting people as ends in themselves and not means to an ends? And Mill asks, what consequences will my actions produce for happiness and suffering? Right? Does that make sense? Right? A student sees a friend cheating. Aristotle says, what does friendship require? What does honesty require? Kant asks, does cheating use anybody? Mill says, who benefits? Who hurts by cheating or reporting cheating or ignoring cheating, right? Philosophy doesn't always make moral life easy, right? It just makes these challenges visible. Being good is in essence being good is not the same as looking good, right? It's very likely to have the right actions and the wrong character, right? We can talk about justice and practice domination. We can preach love and still use people, right? Ethics asks whether or not our lives have moral weight, right? When the performance is over, right? Does that make sense, right? So, what moral habit are you practicing every day without naming it, right? That's in your reflection question. So, here's for your quiz questions. What is ethics? Who is Aristotle? And why is he important in moral philosophy? Um, what does eudaimonia mean? That term I said earlier. Um, how are virtues forms according to Aristotle, right? Um, who is Kant? Well, what is his contribution? What is deontology, right? What is the categorical imperative, right? Um, and what does it mean to treat people as ends and not means to an end, right? And then who is John Stuart Mill? Uh, and what was his influence? What is utilitarianism? And what's the problem with utilitarianism? All right. So which moral lens most challenge you right now? Which one are you more leaning to? Character, duty, or consequences, right? Which one do you operate mainly on? And tell me